Holman Correctional Facility isn't just a prison, it's a battlefield sealed in concrete. A place where inmates run the night, officers fear the morning, and the death chamber hums quietly behind thick steel doors. Every hallway tells a story soaked in blood, smoke, and desperation. And today, we're stepping inside. Subscribe script inserted naturally. Before we open the gates to Alabama's most feared prison, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because what you're about to hear is raw, real, and unlike any prison story you've ever heard. Holman Correctional Facility sits deep in the pine forests of Atmore, Alabama, a remote stretch of land where the air is hot, the mosquitoes are relentless, and hope evaporates long before it reaches the razor wire. People call it the Slaughterhouse, and for decades, the name has clung to Holman like a scar that will never heal. Built in 1969, it was already falling apart by the early 2000s, overcrowded, understaffed, and ruled not by the correctional officers, but by the inmates who had learned to survive in a world where violence wasn't a possibility, it was a guarantee. Walking into Holman for the first time feels less like entering a prison and more like stepping into an active conflict zone. The concrete walls vibrate with the echoes of distant shouting. Metal bunks slam against the floors. Radios scream emergency codes so often that officers stop reacting. The chaos becomes background noise like wind, or rain, or the hum of fluorescent lights. It's constant. Unavoidable. And every inmate knows that one wrong look, one wrong word, could be the last mistake they ever make. Holman wasn't designed for human survival. The ventilation barely works, turning the dorms into ovens in the summer and smoke chambers during the endless stream of fires inmates set to get attention or revenge. The overcrowding is so extreme that men sleep inches apart, their belongings tied to bedframe poles, their shoes tucked under their heads so no one steals them at night. In Holman, even your shoes can cost you your life. And yet, the strangest part isn't the violence itself, it's the silence of the staff. Because Holman is severely understaffed, sometimes only 1 or 2 officers are assigned to watch a dorm of over 100 inmates. That's not supervision. That's survival. And the inmates know it. The balance of power doesn't lean in one direction at Holman, it collapses entirely. One former officer described it best. Holman isn't controlled by the Department of Corrections. It's controlled by whoever has the most knives that day. Knives, known as shanks, are everywhere. They're carved from bed frames, metal trays, fan parts, and even melted plastic sharpened against the walls. Some are tiny and easy to conceal. Others are long enough to resemble short swords. But all of them serve the same purpose: protection. Or domination. Or revenge. Because Holman houses some of Alabama's most violent offenders, lifers, gang enforcers, and men who've spent decades building reputations sharper than the blades they carry. And in a place with almost no staff presence, the inmates enforce their own order. Step inside Dorm C, and you'll see a hierarchy carved into the very rhythm of daily life. The shot callers sit near the back wall, where they can see every movement in the room. Their lieutenants patrol the aisles, eyeing newcomers with silent warnings. The weakest inmates cluster near the exits, hoping that being close to a door might somehow save them if things erupt. But that's an illusion. When violence explodes in Holman, and it does, often, there is no safe place. There are only survivors and headlines. The prison yard tells another story, one of desperation. The grass died long ago, leaving only dirt packed hard from thousands of footsteps. The fence that separates the yard from the open fields beyond seems almost symbolic, freedom resting just inches past the chain links, yet impossibly distant. Inmates pace the yard like restless predators, exchanging contraband, settling debts, or quietly planning the next power shift. Every man has a role. Every man has a code. And every man knows the price of breaking it. But beneath all of Holman's chaos lies a chilling centerpiece: the death chamber. Alabama's execution room sits inside this very prison, giving Holman an aura unlike any other facility in the state. Inmates live and die under the same roof. The execution chamber is cold, silent, and hidden behind a heavy steel door. Men sentenced to die breathe the same air, hear the same echoes, and walk the same hallways as everyone else. At night, when the prison quiets just slightly, some swear they can feel a heaviness, an invisible presence spreading through the walls. Holman doesn't just punish. It consumes. And for the men trapped inside, the only rule that matters is simple. Stay alive. However you can. Nightfall at Holman Correctional Facility doesn't bring silence, only a different tone of chaos. The sun drops behind the tree line, the heat settles into the concrete, and the prison's atmosphere shifts like a living creature awakening from a nap. For some inmates, nighttime is when they hide. For others, it's when they thrive. But for everyone, it's when the real Holman comes alive. Inside the dorms, the flickering fluorescent lights hum overhead, casting long, shaky shadows across the cramped rows of bunks. Conversations drop to whispers. Eyes sharpen. Every sound becomes a potential warning, the metallic screech of a bunk shifting, the sudden thump of shoes hitting the floor, the low murmur of men repositioning themselves before sleep or before something else. Nighttime is when alliances are tested, debts are collected, and fear spreads like smoke. But there's one night in Holman's history that still sends chills through officers and inmates alike, the night the power went out. It happened without warning. No storm, no rain, no explanation. One moment the lights buzzed with their usual pale glow, and the next, everything went black. Total darkness. The kind of darkness that swallows shapes, faces, and hope all at once. For a second, there was complete silence, as if the entire prison drew a sharp breath, unsure of what would come next. Then the screams began. Holman's dorms, already overcrowded and understaffed, became absolute chaos. In the blackout, officers couldn't see the inmates, and inmates couldn't see each other, but the fear made them lash out anyway. Men swung blindly, fighting ghosts in the dark, desperate to defend themselves from threats they could not see. Fists hit metal bunks. Bodies collided against the walls. Somewhere in the confusion, someone shouted that a group was moving through the dorm with weapons. Whether it was true or not didn't matter. Panic turned rumor into reality. Flashlights became lifelines. Officers sprinted down the tier with shaky beams of light slicing through the darkness. But each officer was just one person facing a sea of silhouettes. They were outnumbered, outmatched, and completely unprepared. Their radios crackled with desperate calls for help, but the staffing levels were so low that the response was almost symbolic. Holman was on its own. Inmates who had lived here for years knew instantly what a full blackout meant. Holman had no functioning backup generators for the dorms at the time, not ones that worked the way they should. The prison, for those long minutes, reverted to its most primal form, survival of the strongest, fastest, or most ruthless. One lifer named Carter, who'd already spent 20 years inside, described it later. When the lights go, you feel death breathing behind you. Not a man. Death. In the pitch darkness, the social hierarchy didn't matter. The tough, the weak, the gang members, the lone wolves, everyone was vulnerable. Some men pressed themselves against the walls, hoping the chaos would pass by. Others used the confusion to settle old scores. There were whispers that night, whispers of inmates who vanished into the dark and didn't come back out until the lights flickered back to life. Down the hallway, the death chamber sat in silence. The heavy door stood still, a steel reminder of the state's final authority. But even that room wasn't untouched by the blackout. Officers later recalled how eerie it was to see the corridor plunged into darkness, as if the building itself was holding its breath. When the lights finally snapped back on one flicker, then another, Holman looked like a battlefield. Blood on the floors. Inmates curled in corners. Officers trying to regain control using voices that trembled just slightly from the adrenaline. And yet, remarkably, the prison didn't collapse entirely. Men returned to their bunks. Officers steadied their hands. The chaos simmered down into tense silence. Because at Holman, recovery doesn't mean healing. It simply means waiting for the next eruption. The blackout became an unofficial legend. Not talked about in public. Not acknowledged in reports. But whispered about in the dorms like a ghost story passed from one generation of inmates to the next. And even today, those who lived through it say the same thing. Holman didn't fall apart that night. It revealed what it really is. A war zone disguised as a prison. A place where order survives on a thread. And where darkness, literal or metaphorical, always comes back. Inside Holman Correctional Facility, The gangs aren't just groups. They are governments, structured, disciplined, and deeply rooted in the prison's DNA. Every dorm, every yard corner, every hallway has invisible borders carved not by the administration, but by the inmates who enforce order in ways the understaffed officers never could. Holman's gangs operate like small nations, each one with its own rules, taxes, foot soldiers, and consequences for disobedience. The three dominant forces, the Bloods, the GDs, and the Southern Brotherhood, each control different pieces of the prison's ecosystem. Their influence doesn't come from flashy displays or loud threats. It comes from quiet organization, unwavering loyalty, and the understanding that survival in Holman often depends on picking the right side. Neutrality is a luxury few can afford. In Dorm E, the Bloods hold the back left corner near the cold water fountain. Their shot caller, a stocky man known simply as Red, has been at Holman for over a decade. Red doesn't shout orders. He doesn't need to. A nod from him can decide whether an inmate eats in peace, gets access to protection, or faces the consequences of unpaid debts. Under his leadership, the Bloods control a network of trading food items, bunk space, and even favors that can make someone's life a little easier or a lot harder. Across the yard, the gangster disciples gather under the flagpole during recreation time. Their leader, a tall, quiet man named Bishop, is famous for his discipline. Bishop runs his section like a military unit, strict routines, strict punishment, and no tolerance for impulsive violence. If someone under Bishop's leadership starts unnecessary trouble, they answer to him before they ever face the officers. And inmates will tell you privately, facing Bishop is worse. Then there's the Southern Brotherhood, a white supremacist gang with deep roots in Alabama's prison system. Their presence is unmistakable. Bald heads, clenched fists, and symbolic tattoos mark their members like walking warnings. They occupy the corner closest to the canteen line, controlling the flow of store items, ramen noodles, chips, hygiene packs, and taxing anyone who wants to buy more than the basics. Their economy runs on intimidation, precision, and a strict hierarchy that leaves no room for weakness. But despite their differences, the gangs of Holman share one truth: the prison forces them to be smarter, more strategic, and more united than ever. Holman is overcrowded and understaffed, and that imbalance creates opportunities and pressures that reshape the entire prison culture. In an environment where officers are outnumbered 100 to 1, gangs often become the only functioning order. They prevent unnecessary chaos because chaos disrupts business. They mediate disputes because disputes can bring heat. They manage their dorms because the state simply can't. Some officers quietly admit they rely on gang leadership just to get through the shifts without a riot breaking out. But that doesn't mean things stay peaceful. Tension at Holman simmers just below the surface. A single argument can trigger a chain reaction, one that ripples through dorms, across affiliations, and into places even the leaders can't fully control. And one such argument in the summer of 2014 nearly burned the entire prison to the ground. It started over something small, an unpaid debt for a pack of noodles. The inmate who owed the debt belonged to the GDs. The one who demanded payment was connected to the Southern Brotherhood. Under normal circumstances, the shot callers would have negotiated a solution. But that week, Bishop had been transferred temporarily for medical exams, and Red was dealing with internal conflicts in his own ranks. There was no leadership watching carefully. No eyes tracking the growing tension. So when the Brotherhood enforcer demanded payment again, things escalated quickly. Witnesses say he shoved the GD right in the center walkway of Dorm F. A mistake. Because in Holman, disrespect is a match and the dorm is a pool of gasoline. Within seconds, fists flew. Then knives appeared. The dorm exploded into a full-blown gang brawl, each side calling for reinforcements from neighboring dorms. Officers watching through the reinforced glass couldn't intervene, not with only 2 staff members on the entire block. Alarms blared. Radios screamed. The prison yard filled with inmates rushing to see what was happening. The violence spilled out like a tidal wave, and for a terrifying stretch of minutes, Holman teetered on the edge of a full-scale riot. But then something unexpected happened. The leaders stepped in, not officers, not administrators, but the gang shot callers themselves. Red stormed into the chaos and shouted at his side to stand down. Bishop, returned early from his appointment, confronted the GDs and forced them back. Even the Brotherhood's ranking enforcer stepped forward, face bloody, demanding his men pull back. Each gang realized the same thing: if this turned into a riot, Holman would go into lockdown for months. No trades. No business. No communication. Nothing. Order returned, bloody, shaky, temporary, but order nonetheless. That incident revealed something crucial about Holman: power here isn't controlled by uniforms. It's controlled by structure. And structure, in a place where survival is the currency of life, means everything. Holman's gang network is more than violence, it's a blueprint for surviving a world abandoned by everyone except those trapped inside. The next chapter explores one of Holman's darkest events, the moment when the inmates decided they'd had enough. The uprising at Holman wasn't a sudden explosion born from a single moment. It was a pressure cooker: years of overcrowding, unbearable heat, broken systems, and desperation building layer by layer until the steel could no longer contain it. By 2016, Holman had earned a reputation across Alabama as a prison spiraling out of control. Men were being housed in spaces never meant to hold that many bodies. Officers were quitting faster than the state could replace them. And violence had become the prison's default language. Then came the night the inmates decided they weren't going to take it anymore. It began in the dorms closest to the segregation unit. Word had been spreading that 2 inmates had been stabbed earlier that day, one in a dispute over stolen commissary, another during an argument that broke out in the lunch line. The officers had managed to regain control, but barely. The tension afterward felt like a storm rolling in. Inmates whispered to each other, glancing across the room, watching for signals no outsider would understand. Holman thrives on signals. Hand gestures. Nods. A glance that lasts half a second too long. Everything means something, and everyone is always watching. That night, a group of inmates sat together near the back of Dorm C, their heads close, their voices low. They were not all from the same gang. In fact, they represented 3 different factions, a rare sight in a prison where alliances barely stretch across bunks. But they had one thing in common: they believed Holman was no longer livable. They believed the administration was failing them. And most importantly, they believed it was time to force change, no matter the cost. Rumors spread like wildfire. Something was going to happen. No one knew exactly what, but the air shifted, tense, electric, dangerous. Even the officers felt it. The shift commander on duty later admitted that he had a gnawing feeling in his gut, something he'd only felt twice in his entire career. A sense that the prison was holding its breath. Then, around 9:30 p.m., the doors to Dorm C rattled violently. It happened fast. Too fast for officers to react. A group of inmates had pried part of a metal bunk loose, using it as a makeshift battering ram. Within seconds, they slammed the dorm door off its hinges. The sound echoed down the hallway like a cannon blast. Officers scrambled, radios crackling with panic, but they were outnumbered nearly 30-1. There was no stopping what came next. Inmates poured out of the dorm like a flood, angry, determined, unstoppable. They knew the layout of the prison better than anyone. They moved with purpose, splitting into groups, cutting down the hallways, shouting for others to join them. Within minutes, multiple dorms erupted in coordinated chaos. Fire alarms began screeching as smoke filled the hallways. Someone had set mattresses ablaze, using them as barricades and distractions. The control room became the prize. If inmates could reach it, they could unlock doors, shut down systems, and plunge the entire facility into their control. Officers raced to block the corridor leading to the control station, but the sheer number of inmates forced them to retreat, barricading themselves inside the room. Outside, the prison burned, both metaphorically and literally. The uprising wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. For the first time in decades, the inmates had taken control of large sections of Holman. They weren't fighting to escape. They weren't fighting each other. They were fighting the system. And the message was clear: they wanted conditions to improve, staffing to increase, and violence to be taken seriously by the administration. One inmate stood atop a table in the hallway, shouting over the noise. "We're dying in here. We're drowning. And nobody listens until something like this happens. The flames, the shouts, the pounding of fists against metal, all of it blended into a symphony of desperation, a cry for change that Alabama could no longer ignore. Hours passed. Negotiators arrived. Tactical teams surrounded the prison. It took the early morning sun creeping over the razor wire for the uprising to finally lose momentum. Some inmates surrendered willingly, exhausted. Others held their ground until riot shields pushed them back into their dorms. By the end, Holman was a wreck: burned walls, destroyed bunks, shattered glass, and a trail of injuries. The administration labeled it a riot. The inmates called it a rebellion. But those who were there know the truth: it was a breaking point. Holman had become too violent, too overcrowded, too run down to contain the fire simmering inside. The uprising wasn't madness, it was math. Something had to give. And that night, it did. In the aftermath, Alabama officials promised reforms. But those inside Holman knew promises were often just paper. And paper burns easily. The next chapter takes us into the heart of Holman's most feared location, where death is not just a sentence, but a neighbor. Deep inside Holman Correctional Facility, behind a sequence of locked doors and silent hallways, sits the room that defines the prison more than anything else: the execution chamber. For decades, Alabama's most feared room has lived here, cold, isolated, and heavy with a presence prisoners can feel long before they ever see it. Holman isn't just a maximum security facility. It's the state's execution site. Men live, sleep, argue, dream, and fight within walking distance of their own potential death. The chamber lies behind a thick steel door, painted the same light gray as the surrounding walls, as if it's trying to blend in. But nothing can disguise it. Inmates call it the room, the box, or simply behind the curtain. It's not just a part of Holman, it's the heart of it. And like any heart, it pumps something through the prison's veins. Not blood. Not life. But fear. Most prisons separate the death row unit from the general population psychologically, if not physically. At Holman, the separation is thin, paper thin. The men on death row can sometimes hear distant echoes from the main block, voices rising, bunks clanging, radios squawking. And the general population knows exactly where the death chamber sits. They walk past the hallway occasionally during movement. They see the signs. They hear the stories. And all of it creates an atmosphere unlike any other prison in America. Because Holman houses not just inmates, but the final moments of the condemned. Death row inmates live in a separate wing, small cells, heavy locks, dim lighting. The corridor is quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that feels forced, unnatural. Some inmates read all day, their noses buried in books. Others stare at the walls, carving calendars into the paint with anything sharp enough to scratch. A few talk to each other through the vents, creating conversations in whispers and echoes. And then there are the men who don't talk much at all. Holman veterans say you can tell who's closest to execution without ever reading a document. They move differently, slower, heavier, as if gravity pulls harder on them. They sit for long stretches listening to things others can't hear. And when the state schedules an execution, the entire prison feels it. The process is clinical on paper. A date. A time. A protocol. But in reality, it shakes Holman to its core. The day of an execution begins early. Officers move with a different stiffness. Their voices drop. Their eyes look away a little more often. They know the routine, but routine doesn't make it easier. No one says the word execution. They call it the event. But everyone knows exactly what is coming. The death row wing becomes a hive of contained tension. Some inmates pray. Some write letters. Others pace until their legs shake. And even the toughest men, lifers with decades behind bars, fall silent, because executing someone who has been living just yards away affects everyone, not just the condemned. General population inmates feel it too. A strange coldness creeps through the dorms. Conversations stop abruptly. Even gangs pause their business. In Holman, death is not a rumor, it's a neighbor. In the early evening, the condemned is led down the hallway for the final time. The hall has a smell inmates swear they can recognize even from a distance, a mix of disinfectant and cold metal. As they pass, the air shifts. Some inmates press their hands against their cell doors. Others turn away. A few whisper encouragement, prayers, or apologies. Whether the condemned man is guilty, innocent, feared, or forgotten doesn't matter at that moment. What matters is that he is one of them. The death chamber is small, almost disappointingly so. A glass window on one side for witnesses. The gurney in the center. Straps laid neatly across white sheets. Machines humming softly in the background. Everything is sterile, organized, deliberate, like a doctor's office built for endings instead of healing. When the process begins, the prison holds its breath. Some men close their eyes. Others sit perfectly still, listening for distant sounds they're never sure are real. And when the announcement finally comes, when the state confirms the execution is complete, Holman exhales. Not in relief. Not in agreement. But in heaviness. Because the shadow of that room stretches long. After an execution, the prison's tension doesn't vanish. It lingers for days. The dorms grow quieter. Officers walk slower. Even the violence dips for a short while, as if the killing done by the state temporarily replaces the killing that happens inside. And yet, the routine eventually resumes. Knives appear again. Debts rise. Gang politics resume. Arguments escalate. Life moves forward, because in Holman, survival is the first rule and memory the second. But no inmate forgets the proximity of that room. No officer forgets the silence surrounding it. And no one, no matter how hardened, can deny the weight it places on the prison. Holman isn't just a war zone. It's a war zone with an execution chamber at its center. And the next chapter takes us into the one part of Holman even killers fear, the segregation unit, better known as the hotbox. The segregation unit at Holman Correctional Facility is a place so feared, inmates talk about it the same way soldiers talk about trenches. Everyone knows someone who's been there. Everyone knows someone who didn't come back the same. And everyone understands that once those steel doors slam shut behind you, you disappear not from the prison, but from the world of noise, light, and movement. Segregation is where Holman strips a person down to their barest self. It's not just punishment. It's psychological warfare. Inmates call it the hotbox. Not officially, of course. But the nickname stuck because of the heat, thick, suffocating heat that sits on your chest like weight. Summertime turns the cells into ovens. Winter cold bites through the concrete like it has fangs. There's no temperature control. No airflow. Just a narrow slit in the door and a tiny window that barely lets in the sun. Segregation at Holman isn't like the rest of the prison. There are no dorms, no communal noise, no constant movement. It's a long corridor lined with small concrete cells, each one barely bigger than the space needed for a bunk, a toilet, and a body. Men inside talk to themselves, sleep at odd hours, and stare at walls until their eyes sting. Days blur into nights until time feels like it's melting away. Guards walk past quietly, boots clicking against the floors. The sound is maddening. It's the only indicator of movement, the only reminder that the world outside the cell still functions. Inmates learn the rhythm of those footsteps. Some count them. Some curse them. Others beg for them to stop. Inside the hotbox, a man has only 3 companions: heat, silence, and his own thoughts. It's where the most unpredictable inmates are housed. It's where the most violent moments end. And it's where the administration sends men they can't control anywhere else. But not even segregation brings true separation at Holman. Because even in isolation, inmates find ways to communicate. They shout through vents, tap on walls, or slide notes under the doors using strings made from ripped sheets. It's primitive, but it works. A whisper passed through the vents can travel an entire hallway in minutes. The hotbox is also the place where Holman's darkest stories unfold. One of the most well-known tales revolves around an inmate named Titus, a man who'd been inside Holman for almost 15 years. Titus wasn't the biggest. He wasn't a gang member. But he had a reputation for refusing to bow to anyone, officers or inmates. It was that refusal that landed him in segregation more times than he could count. On his last stay in the hotbox, Titus snapped. He'd been locked in for nearly 3 months. His meals came through a small tray slot in the door. Guards barely spoke to him. The lights flickered constantly. His world narrowed to a 6-foot cell where every second felt like a weight dragging him down. One night, after hours of listening to another inmate scream for help 2 cells down, Titus broke into a manic rage. He ripped his mattress apart, shredded his sheets, and screamed for anyone, to open the door. No one did. By morning, he was curled in the corner, arms wrapped around his knees, staring at nothing. A guard walking past described it later. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking through me. That is the hotbox's true power. It doesn't just punish the body. It reaches deeper, clawing at the mind until the man inside becomes unrecognizable. Some inmates adapt, finding ways to keep themselves sane, writing on the walls, working out constantly, reciting long passages from memory. But others crumble. They lose track of days. They lose track of thought. They lose track of themselves. And the worst part? In Holman, segregation isn't always used for violence. Sometimes it's used simply because there's nowhere else to put a man. Overcrowding forces officers to rotate inmates through the unit even when they don't belong there. It becomes a warehouse for the forgotten. The screams echo through the hallway at night. The smell of sweat, fear, and steel lingers in the air. And the silence between those screams is somehow even worse. Inmates who return from the hotbox carry something in their eyes, a haunted look, a mixture of anger and exhaustion that no other part of the prison creates. Even gang leaders, men who hold power in the dorms, lower their voices when talking about segregation. They know it doesn't matter how tough you are. The hotbox doesn't care. Holman's segregation unit is the perfect reflection of the prison itself: hot, overcrowded, unforgiving, decaying. A place where time slows, sanity frays, and survival becomes a battle fought in the mind long before it reaches the body. But as brutal as the hotbox is, it's nothing compared to what comes next. Because the next chapter takes us into the one part of Holman where chaos becomes coordinated, where violence becomes strategy, and where the prison's darkest alliances take shape. The yard. When you peel back the layers of chaos inside Holman Correctional Facility, you're left with one undeniable truth: this place was never just a prison. It became a battlefield, an ecosystem shaped by desperation, violence, corruption, and the silent, grinding pressure of overcrowding and neglect. Every hallway inside Holman tells a different story, but they all end the same way, with someone losing something: freedom, safety, sanity, or life itself. For decades, Alabama tried to keep Holman out of the spotlight, burying its failures behind razor wire and concrete. But the truth was louder than the silence they attempted to maintain. Riots, stabbings, guard walkouts, lockdowns, smuggled phones broadcasting chaos in real time, Holman refused to stay hidden. And maybe that's why this story matters. Because Holman wasn't just a prison falling apart, it was a warning. A blueprint for what happens when a system is pushed to its breaking point, and then pushed even further. When you starve people of resources, rehabilitation, and basic human dignity, you don't get order. You get rebellion. You get survivalism. You get a place where control collapses and the inmates take over. Yet within all the violence, there were moments, small, almost invisible moments, where you could see something else. Men trying to make peace. People trying to change. Lifers mentoring teenagers. Groups forming truces. Even guards, burned out, underpaid, overwhelmed, trying to perform an impossible job in impossible conditions. Holman was brutal, but it was also honest. It exposed the truth about how fragile the prison system can be once the balance of power shifts. And that's where Holman's legacy lives today. Not in the headlines, or the viral cell phone footage, or the political speeches that came afterwards. But in the unanswered question it leaves behind. What happens when a prison stops functioning like a prison, and starts functioning like a war zone? And more importantly, how many more facilities across America are on the verge of becoming the next Holman? This documentary isn't just the end of a story. It's the beginning of a bigger conversation. A conversation about prisons, about people, about policy, and about what happens when a system built to contain chaos becomes the chaos itself. If you've stayed with this story until the end, it means you understand the weight of what Holman represents. And if you want more deep dive documentaries, stories that expose the darkest corners of the justice system, then make sure you stay connected. Because trust me, there are more prisons with secrets. More stories waiting to be uncovered. More war zones hiding behind walls. Thank you for watching. Stay aware. Stay curious. And until the next story, stay safe.